It's a little difficult in 10 minutes to give you all you need to argue against the cultural relativists you probably confront more often than you'd like. I'm in the academy, and they are far more numerous than those of us who see there is no conflict whatsoever in defending human rights and looking sensitively at another's culture through the lens of anthropology or literature, for example. So what I want to do is offer some practical advice, give you some concrete answers to the question why female genital mutilation is the term of choice for the subject at hand, given the suggestion that cutting is a better word or circumcision is still a word to use. I quote Natalie Angier in Woman, an Intimate Geography to start. She defines it thus: genital mutilation is an extreme abuse of human rights. Like slavery and apartheid, it's unacceptable. How can we stop it? By talking about it with angry, unbitten tongues, by never forgetting about it, and by not letting the issue slide back into obscurity now that we have learned of its pervasiveness and tenacity. I prepared a PowerPoint, and had I been able to show it, I would ask you to contemplate Leyla Hussein, L-E-Y-L-A, Hussein, and to go to YouTube and Google The Cruel Cut. That is her film, and it answers this question, why is it mutilation, much better than I could do. But she also, her presence here is also a key to my own approach. The words I'm going to offer you are mainly not my own. They are those of the survivors who want you to understand precisely what it is they've gone through. Leyla Hussein answers the question as follows: why should we call it mutilation? Out of respect for the viewpoint of the sufferers. Sufferers like her, who founded Daughters of Eve, an association in the UK, who abjure the paternalism they perceive in outsiders' attempts to sanitize and mute their language of anguish. And after all, seasoned African campaigners chose the term mutilation, making it official in the early 90s. Specifically, a regional conference of the Inter-African Committee in Addis Ababa had proposed altering the terminology, and in 1991, at a UN seminar held in Burkina Faso, recommended using this exact language. It's now codified, female genital mutilation, in the World Health Assembly Resolution, WHA 4618, and other instruments. It also appeared in the final documents in Beijing, the UN Women's Conference. The Inter-African Committee, which is an all-African association, stands fiercely behind the use of this medical term. And to ensure that the world sees it from their point of view, they launched International Zero Tolerance to Female Genital Mutilation Day in 2004. Their position is most clearly available in what is called the Bamako Declaration on the terminology FGM, passed at the 6th IAC General Assembly in 2005, signed in Mali. This was the background also to the very successful campaign that led on December 20th, 2012, to the UN General Assembly, of course, passing its Ban FGM Worldwide resolution. Back to the question of cultural relativism. Just 2 weeks ago, when I was asked to organize a one-day workshop on FGM at Oxford on March 7th, 2015, and I say it in case anyone is interested in coming, as the official International Gender Studies contribution to the university's annual Women's Festival, I was surprised to discover that my assigned co-organizer was actually using the term FGC, meaning either cutting or circumcision. So I revealed to her the following, what had been told to me by Effa Wadorkanu, our good friend who recently passed, as standing behind key terms in the Bamako Declaration. And here I will quote an incendiary passage. This was composed by the Inter-African Committee. While we appreciate the efforts made in response to FGM on the continent and the diaspora, it is patronizing and belittling to African women and girls to have outsiders define their oppression. Indeed, what gives anyone but Africans the right to change a term agreed upon by the largest group of African activists on this issue in the world? This is at best paternalism, and is a sad reflection of how, after many years of African women working against FGM, when FGM was a taboo, the campaign has been hijacked by others not involved in the beginning and who do not appreciate the nature of the struggle. We demand that international agencies recognize the right of NGOs in the field to continue to use female genital mutilation and not to be denied funding because of this. You can Google this quite easily for the whole text. What is unequivocal in these words, that certain unnamed funders attempted to strong-arm Africans into using a vocabulary that diminishes the harm, and the African activists with whom I work consider this to be both racist and neocolonialist. That is, intimidation was involved. Grassroots initiatives in Africa were being dictated to by mainly white outsiders and threatened with cuts to their funding if they didn't toe the line and call it by milder, misleading, and ultimately obfuscating words, including the word cutting. Toward the end of the 90s, in a 40-minute phone call, Efewa Dorkanu revealed to me many of the details behind these charges that have not, for obvious reasons of dependency and diplomacy, been made public. But by now you understand, I'm sure, that the idea of radical, feminist African leadership is central. When in 1977 I first began work on the issue, we in Germany felt it imperative to consult more experienced African activists, and here I will name some of those to whom Linda already dedicated her speech. Awa Thiam, Edna Adan Ismail, who has a special hospital for dealing with patients in Somaliland now, Nawal El Sadawi, Maria Assad, Dr. Irene Thomas, and we were in touch with these pioneers. I've worked over the course of years with them and continue to do so with those who are still alive. But I want to dedicate this talk to two leaders in particular. You've heard them. Efewa Dorkanu is one, and Kadi Kowita is the other. Linda had mentioned her. Efewa wrote Cutting the Rose, called Cutting the Rose, Female Genital Mutilation. And we can take comfort in the fact that her project, The Girl Generation, an African-led movement, became reality only 1 week before she died. My other hero, Kadi Kowita, I'm going to quote her, although no one here is likely unaware of what FGM entails. But the words of survivors themselves help us to understand our own choice of terminology and certainly help to convince others that relativism is a wrong-headed concept. Ensuring dissemination of survivor testimony was in fact the rationale behind a publishing company that I have founded called UnCUT Voices Press. What I discovered was that many works in French, German, and Italian were simply not being translated into English, and the result was an impoverishment of the discussion in the Anglo world. So most striking, for instance, was Kadi's absence. It took at least 5 years before I picked up her manuscript called Mutilation, which in fact served to stimulate the UN debate and passage of the ban FGM, because the book was distributed to 56 members of the General Assembly. In any case, what happens in Bloodstains, which I've translated Mutilation as? Bloodstains, a child of Africa reclaims her human rights. Kadi undergoes excision and then, having just turned 14, is forced to marry an immigrant sanitation worker who brings her to Paris, so you've already got forced marriage as well. Then she faces marital rape night after night, gives birth to 5 children in as many years before her husband reports a second wife who is also 15. Kadi is literate, which is a tremendous advantage because most of her friends from Senegal are not. And this puts them even more at risk of brutal husbands. Many men disapprove of birth control and beat their wives if they are taking the pill. The men also control the purse strings. But who then, in the 80s, was there to help the young person without money, without marketable skills, with dependent children, who has been excised and forced to endure that particular suffering and sorrow? To whom does she turn? At that time, there was no one. And yet, Kadi deployed her feistiness, intelligence, and courage, and became a key spokeswoman against FGM, founding the European network and inspiring others with her honesty. Because revealing intimate details of what did happen to her genitals is not easy, but she insists on explaining clitoridectomy in Senegal as a prelude to clinical trauma, and in such a way that the term mutilation may even seem too weak for what is actually done. So, I quote, "The 4th or 5th in line, I was seated, trembling at every level, my entire body strained by the agony behind the wall. Then 2 women caught me and dragged me inside. One took hold of my head, her knees crushing my shoulders. The other clasped me firmly by the thighs and spread my legs. Using her fingers, the exciser grasped the clitoris and whacked it off like a piece of zebu meat. Often, she can't hack it off in one go, so she's obliged to saw. As for the pain, which Kadi has, quote, never succeeded in describing because nothing has been so violent, she says it was, quote, like yanking out your guts, like a hammer in your skull, and not only down there, but everywhere. Her body becoming home to a famished rat or an army of ants. I was swallowed whole by horror, she writes, engulfed from my brain, through my belly, to my feet. My body was nothing but nerves in a vice in my head, and about to be detonated bomb. I felt like my frame had been hacked into. Years later, she laments, she still hears herself howling. And as we know, torture leaves scars in the brain, as does amputation, even with the use of anesthesia. Kimita Chris is a Kenyan resident in Germany, and from the Maasai tribe, her depiction seconds Kadi's in almost every way. I was going to read it to you. I'm bringing out this book called Kimita, Maasai Speaking Out Against FGM, but I set my watch up and it's telling me I have 2 minutes left. So I'm going to skip what she tells you about being tied and having post-traumatic stress disorder and a life that's with pain constantly her companion. I conclude that multiple variants exist. You don't really need to hear more than Kadi's. But basically, this is what it is. This is what critics prefer not to discuss. This is even what timid, some might say cautious, advocates of abolition want to hide, because you agree it is just too terrible. And it is also, I should add, a hand grenade that any card-carrying racist would be just delighted to lob. But as forward Germany enshrines in its statutes, integral to the fight against FGM is an anti-racist stance, an explicit anti-racist stance, because this is an emotional issue par excellence. And it remains a neglected human rights abuse partly because it is so distasteful, the memories is suppressed by victims, the facts are too vile for outsiders to grasp, and the fear that revealing them will incite latent racists. After all, experiments in neuroimaging have shown subjects revulsion, not sympathy, when viewing photos of folks in distress, their brains reacting as if to things, not people. Well-crafted stories, however, can stimulate care. Neuroscience measures the effects of oxytocin, the so-called bonding hormone, associated with connection, promoting empathy and generosity when we are confronted with well-crafted stories. Not surprisingly, grassroots efforts to stop FGM use narrative extensively, even if literary crafting in campaigns has yet to be examined in depth. Both Kadi and Kaminta tell life stories. Efua Dorkanu in her book served as amanuensis for others' life stories. So, last paragraph here. Government accountability for law enforcement and education is the best hope for those affected by a ritual amputation of healthy sexual organs. But an educated public must ensure that these civil society agents do their job. And this acceptance of our civic duty is what girls who endured FGM have been trying to convey. By publishing memoirs, alerting journalists, using social media, tweets and blogs, they call on all people of goodwill to help them deter parents and peers from supporting the blade. Survivors Jaha Dukure, Layla Hussein, Kadi Koita, Kaminta Maria Chris, and others express hope that the deafening silence authorities, governments, and media have maintained for more than 3 decades of effort to end FGM can now see to a sea change in measures to stop it. As the magazine Scientific American Mind has recently taught me, rhesus macacos will not pull a chain that brings them food if they think it will harm a fellow animal. Shouldn't our empathy be as strong as theirs?